thing that I've always wanted to do, and I haven't actually done it yet, is to print out the whole of John's Gospel, which I have done, and to color code the themes. I think that would make a beautiful tapestry on the wall. Because in the ministry that I run in England, it's called Cordeo. It's a small sort of Bible study program, Bible theology, history. And one of the things we do is we take the book of John and we work through it for about 30 hours, just drawing on the page and observing, and you end up with certain symbols. You know, if I come into John, I can do it without thinking now. I've done it so many times. Step over into Paul's writings, and I'm scratching my head like, all these different words. I don't know what symbol to use for that, and how do you distinguish that from that? And but in John, believe and life and death and light and dark, and like we said before, it's just a fairly limited vocabulary, and it just keeps repeating and swirling, and yet there's something very powerful about that, something very accessible about John, which is a really great thing. So, in terms of John's themes here, just listed a few on the page. We've talked about signs, so we don't need to talk more about that. Belief. As you think about John, what's your sense? I don't know how much you've preached it or read it in preparation for this, but what's your sense in terms of the theme of belief? What are some of the elements? Because that's the big one, right? I think it's 98 times. So 98 references to belief. Is it static? Is it always the same? Or is there a spectrum within that? What do you think? Any thoughts? That is in John 8, where you get this I am the light of the world section. And it comes right the way through. You've got the two I am absolutes, 24, 28. And then in 29, Jesus says, he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone. For I always do the things that are pleasing to him. As he was saying these things, many believed in him. Oh, good. Yeah. That's progress. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, and then he pursues on, and within a few verses, he's calling their father the devil. And he's saying, if God were your father, then you would, but instead your father is the devil. And by the end of the chapter, they're ready to stone him. And that was people who believed in him. And so belief seems to be a little bit difficult to grasp when we're looking at it. One easy solution is just to say, this is different people, different situation. But that seems strange. The way that John writes that, it seems to flow straight on. And so there's a belief that seems to be an inadequate belief. You see it at the end of chapter 2. And so when you look at that at the end of 2, again, different languages may handle this better than English, just because of the way English is written. The word entrust and the word believe are the same word. So maybe if it was translated, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many trusted in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Now there was a man. Let it just carry straight on. There was a man of the Pharisees, and here's the example man of the kind of people who believe but don't believe. That's really Nicodemus, isn't it? At the start, he's coming to Jesus saying, Jesus, pleased to meet you. And it's a really kind of polite start to the conversation. We can tell that you're a teacher from God, because no one, could do the things you're doing unless God were with him. And Jesus is rude, right? Jesus is not polite to Nicodemus. It's kind of strange. Jesus' response to Nicodemus is basically, I can't talk to you. If you look at it, truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. So Nicodemus is coming along saying, Jesus, you're impressive. We're impressed with you, Jesus. We really like you, Jesus. In fact, I'm the minister of education here in Jerusalem. I am the teacher of Israel. Jesus tells him that, right? You're the teacher. So the minister of education. Jesus, we would like to give you an honorary doctorate. I think that's what's going on here. Nicodemus is probably representing the Sanhedrin, who have been thinking and struggling with what happened with John the Baptist. John the Baptist came along. He was unorthodox in his style, He was a preacher, but the crowds went after him, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the whole Sanhedrin kind of blew it with him. Didn't handle that one well, so they want to make sure they handle Jesus well. And so he thinks if he comes to Jesus and gives him a degree or gives him an invitation to speak or does something that kind of creates a bit of a network, networking is supposed to be a good thing, so he does that, and he's networking and resources together. It's like an early Israel leadership forum, he's kind of bringing it together with Jesus, and Jesus' response is, I can't talk to you. You want to talk about God stuff, but you're dead. Unless you're born from above, you cannot talk about the kingdom. We're not even on the... Can you understand my words? You don't... I mean, Jesus' response is, wow. He's talking about seeing somebody famous and then mishandling a conversation. Jesus mishandles it, or does he? He's absolutely right. Because Nicodemus is walking around thinking, yeah, I'm in charge of education and I'm a godly guy. And Jesus says, no, you're not. You don't know God. Because you don't realize you're dead. Genesis 3. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. What was Lennox saying? Is this tension between the trusting in God's word and trusting in the serpent's word. Most people that we meet, including in the church, do not believe that they are naturally dead, but we are dead in our sin. And so we think that we can explore and get to grips with and make sense of and try to do our own version of life. And you can do it in a secular way, you can even do it in a church kind of way, but we think it's up to us, like we're independent, self-moved beings. And Jesus is saying, no, you're dead. You need to be given life by the Spirit from above. And so that whole conversation with Nicodemus is just an example of the reality that's described in chapter 2 with the whole crowd. But typical John, instead of dealing with the whole crowd, he raises up an example, a man who believes but doesn't. And of course, by the end of the gospel, we think he does, which is great. So it's a positive one there as well. So belief is a big thing, and it's not as simple as people believe, people don't believe. It's almost like there's a sort of spectrum. And people will come a certain distance in their belief, but they don't cross over into life. And so you see in John 6, a real sense of belief. But ultimately, when Jesus really pushes them and says, you've got to eat my body and drink my blood, they pull away. And so Jesus turns to his disciples. What about you? And their response, Peter's response is, of course, the correct one. Who are we supposed to go to? You have the words of life. And that's a key moment there. So there's lots of, we could say about belief, lots of themes there. What about the life-death theme? Any thoughts on that one? He likes to give the contrast, doesn't he? Life, death, light, dark. And actually, one of the things you see with John is when you put Jesus into a situation, people tend to go into two groups. We talked about the spectrum of belief, but actually people are polarized. John Stott wrote a book called Christ the Controversialist. It's just a great title. I haven't read the book, but I like the title. But he talks about ways that Jesus divides people. Yes. And that's John all the way through.
And what I saw, that there's no room for being gray in between. In between.
No shades of gray, right? Yeah. And so that's an interesting thing when you read John, just the tension that Jesus creates among the religious people. That's something that we need to struggle with a little bit, because it's easy to think that the people that are going to hate Jesus are the sinners, and the people that are going to love Jesus are going to be the religious, until you try church ministry, right? And then what do you discover? Actually, sinners find Jesus very attractive at times, and as they should. And sometimes people who seem to be very, very Christian, in a religious sense, get very upset about Jesus. You can preach all day about what you must do and how you must behave and what you must, what's godliness and what it looks like, and they'll take that on board. The moment you start presenting Jesus and his graciousness and his powerful personality, even in his strong words against sin, whatever, as you present Jesus, what tends to happen is even in a church that you'll get a polarizing effect. Some people will go, oh, I like Jesus. I'm attracted to, I'm drawn in. Other people really don't want Jesus messing with their Christianity. Preaching John is kind of a gentle way to get that effect. If you want to really get that effect, preach Galatians. And then you'll get the blow up. But actually, John kind of takes us there too, doesn't he? So life and death, we've got those themes of life and death. I mean, it's not simply life and death, is it? It's also spiritual life, life of the Spirit. And so we talk about the Spirit in chapter 3. Living water that comes from within in chapter 4, and then again in chapter 7 becomes overt there about the Holy Spirit that he would give to them. And, obviously 14, 16, a lot about the Spirit there. It's a very high view of the Spirit in John. All right, a very significant role that the Spirit plays, and that would be another aspect. What about Father-Son? Where are some of the really key moments for the Father-Son theme in John's Gospel? It's Philip, isn't it, that asks the question. Just show us the Father, that will be enough. In John 14. Have I been with you so long? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's how close the connection is. That's really where John 1:18 kind of gets tied together, isn't it? In John 14:8, that kind of section there. So that's huge. Yeah.
It says that he loves us,
Mm-hmm.
not just us.
Yeah. And then there's the moment, all the way through, he's talking about my Father, and he's talking about your father, the devil, in John 8, and so on. But then, after the resurrection, I'm going to my Father and your Father. Which, again, you can just slip right past that. But if you've taken your time through the whole of John, when you get to that, you go, oh, it creates an excitement. Like, he's my Father now too. That's amazing. And of course, you go to Paul, and he develops that in Romans 8 and Galatians and so on. But that's all building in John. Truth and word. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Any others jump out? What about truth versus the lie? We go there in John 8. John chapter 8, yeah. After Jesus kind of creates this tension with the people who believed in him, in verse 31, he says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And then they get upset. What do you mean free? We are free. And so then he goes on to tell them, no, you're enslaved. And he's not talking about the Romans, although that's ironic that the Roman soldiers are marching past. But, he says, look, you're enslaved. You're enslaved to sin and so on. And they're saying, Abraham is our father, verse 39. Jesus said, if you're Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You're doing the works your father did. They said, we were not born of sexual immorality. So these are people that believed in him. The moment they get poked, they start talking about his reputation. We have one Father, even God. Jesus said, if God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God. Let's drop down here, verse 44. You are of your father, the devil. Your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. And then in my Bible it says, when he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Actually, I think if you look closely in the Greek there, he's following through with the truth, the lie, singular with a definite article. When he speaks the lie, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of it. There it is. I think that's the lie. You will be like God. That's the kind of the crux of that whole package, and that is the lie that goes through Scripture, through history, through life. That's the tension. Do we believe God or do we believe the lie? Which word are we going to trust? And it's referred to here in the singular. It's quite strong, actually, and it's a shame that they don't translate it that way. If you want to ask Wayne Grudem, feel free. He's probably got a good answer, since I'm using his Bible here. But it's there. It's in Romans 1. It's in 2 Thessalonians 2, and Ephesians 4:25. The lie, singular. So that's truth versus not just falsehood and lies in general, but the ultimate lie, which is that we can be independent, godlike beings. That's the lie I think Nicodemus was caught up in. He thinks he's alive. And if you think about it in Genesis, when you've got Adam and Eve created in relationship and dependence upon the God who said, let us make man in our image, that's a powerful, amazing privilege. And then the serpent comes in and whispers to Eve and says, you know what, you can be godlike. Her response should have been, I am godlike. I'm made in his image. But the God that the serpent offered was a lie in itself, wasn't it? The idea that you can be independent. You can be your own God in charge of your own destiny. You can be your own self-defined reality. And if you're living in this lie here, even if you go to this God for benefits, you're missing. You're dead. This is death, separation from God. And yet we as humans love to think that we're being really alive. And so there's that massive tension. And I think John goes after that. And that's why what he's offering is not just a transaction. It's not just here, God's making you an offer, sign this contract with him. No, it's God's inviting you back into the relationship so that you can be a child of God, not just a benefit recipient, not just somebody in a contract, but somebody who's in the covenant relationship, in the reality of fellowship with a loving God. And yet we always want to go back to this. Now, if I pray a certain way, then I'll get benefits out of God and I can carry on living independently. That's why Jesus offends people in churches, because they know how to live a good, godly Christian life and get lots of affirmation from other people. And Jesus says, no, you can't even know God unless you're like this with him. I don't want that. There's a real tension there. So there's all these themes that are weaving through, and you see them stretching through the whole book. I say the whole book, actually, the end of chapter 20 culminates quite a few of them. That section, the purpose statement, these things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. Believe, life, name, and I think signs are referred to there, or something like that. There's 4 key themes. I can look it up later. But those 4 key themes are finished there. Chapter 21, don't mention them at all, but they've been all the way through. If you had them color-coded, you'd have that color all the way through the book until you get to the end of 20. And then 21 is deliberate. It's John. It's not something different and separate, but it's something different in terms of what it's emphasizing. The story of Jesus is complete now, and nothing needs to be added. But what about the disciples? So we'll look at that later in the week. So just looking on the page here, I want us to think about one big theme in John that maybe is unfamiliar. Okay, so bottom of the page, we've talked about this, coming to belief. There's a progression in chapters 2, 3. That's a Jewish belief. Chapter 4, Gentiles. Living water and the Spirit. You've got this Ezekiel theme coming through. Trial of Jesus. This is where I want us to ponder a little bit. The trial of Jesus. And then the lifting up of Jesus, we're going to look at that, or you're going to look at that tomorrow morning. That one's more manageable. Okay, so we'll look at those lifting up of Jesus references, or just lifting up references tomorrow morning. Now, legal procedure. When we look at the Bible, we're coming from a modern, Western legal system. You may have a French type of legal system, or an American type, or a British type. There are different types, but essentially there's a real similarity between our experience of legal systems, right? And actually probably our lack of experience of legal systems. I drive past a court, the courthouse in my town every day when I'm going to the Bible school where I work. Never gone in there. I may never have to. I hope not. It's kind of separate. Right? It's in there. The only exposure I have to legal things are really in the movies. And so actually I probably understand the American system better than the British system because I've probably seen more American courtrooms on the screen than I have British courtrooms.
That doesn't mean you understand
No, right.
You do understand Hollywood's version.
Exactly. And so we all have that kind of Hollywood kind of, you know, big wooden bench, guy in charge. If it's a British one with the wig, if it's an American one without, you know, and the wooden gavel mallet thing, and different people representing and coming forward, and the, you know, so we've got that image in our minds. But if we try to impose that on the Gospels, then we will think inevitably that the trial of Jesus begins the night he's arrested. All right, and on the night that Jesus is arrested, there is a whole sequence of trials. All right, 6. Starts with the one that John tells us about, is with Annas, the high priest. And Annas he wasn't actually the high priest, but he was the power behind the high priests. And so the marketplace in Jerusalem, you know, by the temple that Jesus had turned over all the tables and let the doves go, that was Annas's bazaar. That was Annas's money-making scheme. Annas had been high priest 20 years before. After him, his son had been high priest, and I think there was somebody else briefly. Then his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was high priest for about 18 years, and it was supposed to be a 1-year position according to the rules at that time, but Annas had money, and he'd done a deal with the Romans, and his son-in-law was in for 18 years. And after his son-in-law, another 3 of his sons, and then I think even a grandson. Annas was basically in charge of Jerusalem for 50 years. He was massively powerful. He's kind of like the leader of the mob. If you think in mafia terms, he's the one you don't want to meet because you're really in trouble if you get to Annas. And so when Jesus was arrested, he was brought first of all to Annas, and Annas does the first hearing. It's not really a trial. It's kind of like a pre-trial hearing. All right, he's trying to get Jesus to give him something. I sometimes give the example of, again, this is Hollywood, but kind of let's keep it British so I don't offend Americans, but the British justice system 30 years ago, when somebody was arrested, before you take them into interrogation, you take them into a closet where there's no recording devices, and you just hit them until they give you something, and then you bring them in because they've already confessed. All right, completely corrupt, right? And that's what Annas was doing. He brought Jesus in, and he's trying to get Jesus to say something, and Jesus knows this is completely unnecessary. This is not legitimate, this is not appropriate. And so he starts asking Jesus about his disciples and asking him about his teaching. And Jesus says, you want to know about my teaching? Ask anyone. I've been teaching openly. There's nothing secret about my ministry. You could have heard about it from anyone. I've got nothing to add. No comment. And he doesn't give Annas anything. So in the end, Jesus gets hit because of the way he's speaking to him. But in Jesus' mind, that was a nothing. And then, John skips 2 trials. Okay, he skips forward to the first Pilate trial. Why does he skip what seemed to be the most significant trials of the night? Because the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they do not say a thing about Annas. They don't refer to that at all. They go straight to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. And what they describe is a nighttime trial and a daybreak repeat trial. So the nighttime trial is the big one. Caiaphas is there, a gathering of the Sanhedrin has been gathered, and they're pressing Jesus, and they're trying to find 2 witnesses. And they can't get any 2 people to agree. It must have been really frustrating for them, and obviously for Jesus too. Eventually, they settle on 2 men that can sort of say the same thing. Matthew gives us one, Mark gives us the other, and you compare them and you go, oh, those are technically different, but similar. And those 2 are brought, and those accusations are brought against Jesus. Jesus ignores the accusation because the witnesses don't even agree. And in the end, Caiaphas forces Jesus to speak. And so Jesus quotes. Anyone know where he quotes from? Daniel chapter 7. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds and so on. And Caiaphas rips his clothes. Now we've heard it from his own lips. We don't need witnesses because we are witnesses. He's guilty, which is a stupid way of doing justice, isn't it? You think about it. You bring someone to trial, and then you try to find a charge, and when you can't find one, you force them to say something, and then you charge them with what they've said. I don't know any country that would accept, well, there are some, but most countries would not accept that kind of a trial. But Jesus, that's the way it goes. And they say, right, we've heard it for ourselves, and they beat Jesus, and they mock him, and they say, prophesy, tell us who hit you, and they hand him over to the guards for the rest of the night, which may have been an hour or two. I'm not sure how long was left at this point. And they receive him doing the same thing. And Jesus is going through all of that, and then first thing in the morning, Jesus is brought back. As soon as it's daybreak, he's brought back. There's no witnesses. They just need to make it legal, because they couldn't have a trial at night. Now, this is a lot of stuff that John skips. He skips all of that Caiaphas interrogation. He skips the witnesses. He skips the decision that Jesus should be killed. He skips the fact that he was taken away and beaten and then brought back at daybreak. Why is John skipping all of that? Let's keep that question in our minds. Jesus is brought back, and he stands before Caiaphas, and basically they just want him to repeat what he said the night before, and Jesus goes along with it. I think Jesus, in control, with no sense of defeat, just says, okay, well, they want something, let me give it to them. And he quotes, I think it's Psalm 110 at that point. And he just gives them that, and they go, right, that's it, yeah, guilty, guilty, right. And they go around the room. And we know this not from the text, but from the way the Sanhedrin worked in those days. They would have gone from, officially, from the youngest to the oldest, so that the youngest wouldn't be influenced by the oldest. They'd gone completely backwards during the night when Caiaphas made the declaration, he's guilty. That's completely broken and corrupt. But in the morning, they probably maybe did it the official way. Everybody, guilty, 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 guilty. Right, let's go. We've got what we want. Let's take him to Pilate. And they take Jesus to Pilate, and that's where John's story carries on. So trial 1, John gives us that. Trials 2 and 3, he skips over. Trial 4, there we come to the Pilate episode. And actually, Pilate is trials 4 and 6. Okay, so there's one in between where Jesus is sent off to Herod the Tetrarch. Yeah, I was confused my Agrippas and my Antipasses, but it's the Herod the Tetrarch, who is Antipas II, I think. But he's sent to him, who's in Jerusalem, and there's a whole interaction there. Not interactions, technically not true, because Jesus ignored him. All right, but that was an episode that we get details of in Luke. John skips that one as well. Doesn't serve his purposes. So John just gives us Annas, Pilate, Pilate. He doesn't give us Caiaphas, Caiaphas, Herod. What he gives us with Pilate is a lot of information. You get the whole conversation between Jesus and Pilate. You end up with this really, I think, quite intriguing presentation where effectively what's going on is that you have Pilate outside talking to the religious leaders, and they are the religious authority, and he is the secular authority, and then he's coming in and he's talking to Jesus. And when he comes in and talks to Jesus, he discovers that he has no authority at all, because this man is completely different than what I've ever met in my entire life. But then he comes back out to these, and there's this game of chess, a negotiation back and forth. And the way it begins is interesting. When it starts, they come, and Pilate says, what charge do you bring against him? And they seem surprised. Which seems kind of weird. Why would you be surprised if the judge says, what is the charge? That's the obvious question. But I think that what happened was they were convinced that they had already negotiated with Pilate. They'd already got Pilate to agree, there's a troublemaker, you don't want any trouble, do you, sir? No, I do not. Can we borrow some soldiers to arrest him? Certainly. And so they thought they already had Pilate in agreement. And then when they showed up that morning, maybe because it interrupted his breakfast, whatever. I mean, Pilate, maybe he's eating his Italian salami or something, but he comes out to them, and when they show up, he seems to be really aggravated by and aggravating to the Jewish leaders. Now, a bit of background with Pilate. Pilate was this enigma for years and years. It was one of the things that people pointed to say, who's this Pilate? There's no evidence in history that supports Pilate. There's evidence in history, but that could be made up. But any evidence in archaeology? Nothing. Okay. And so people used to mock Pilate until an Italian archaeologist discovered the Pilate stone. What was that, 1950 something? That was a generation ago, maybe early 60s, late 50s. Pontius Pilatus Praefectum Judei. Whoa, there's a reference to Pilate. Suddenly Pilate's not an issue for the historians anymore, as if he ever was for the biblicists. But Pilate was this guy who actually we do know quite a lot about. He was part of he wasn't technically a Roman, but he was part of the Roman system. He was sent to Jerusalem, or to Judea, for a position that was kind of a step up. It was a progression on his career path. And the person that had got him the appointment was his friend, who was called Sejanus, who became super powerful in the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So much so that Tiberius was often in exile, and Sejanus was kind of like the emperor. He was so powerful. And Pilate was his man, and Pilate is, in Judea, and he's been there for a few years by the time Jesus shows up on his doorstep. But there have been massive problems. Already, Pilate is really in trouble, because basically the way it works is this. If you're going to be in charge of that region, you've got to deal with the Jews. They're a pain. Originally, they were dealt with by Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great. But Archelaus, who was the ethnarch of that region, so the kingdom of Herod the Great, Herod had paid some money to a previous emperor and arranged a deal. When he died, his kingdom was divided. So there was tetrarchies, quarters, 2 of those, and then 1 half. And the half went to Archelaus, and Archelaus was the one who, when Joseph and Mary heard that he was ruling, they avoided it. He was worse than his father. Okay, so Archelaus ruled and was a disaster, couldn't handle it. So the Romans pulled it from him and put a prefect in. Okay, a governor to rule the region. Pilate was one of those. His job was to keep the peace and to collect the taxes. And if he collected the taxes and kept the peace, then he would do well, and eventually he could retire and have all the benefits of Roman wine and Roman cheese and Roman meat and Roman villas and Roman freedom. But if he messed it up, now we should talk about this in Rome, if anyone's coming to Rome in December, this will be fun. We could eat cheese while we talk about Pilate. And so Pilate is there, and basically he's got to keep the peace. Now, how do you keep the peace? My mother was a school teacher, and she sometimes would teach in the school where I was a student. And that was a bit embarrassing for me as a child. I didn't really want to, but I had to go after class and go to her classroom so that I could get a lift home. Okay, so there I was, a 7-year-old, standing outside the door as my mother was in there telling off a whole classroom full of children. And I remember asking her, Mum, why were you telling them off? Oh, they weren't behaving very well. But you seemed really angry. Oh, it's just because it was my first day. So what do you mean? Well, I start angry and then I become nice and they all like me. If I start nice, they take advantage and it's horrible. Okay, that makes sense, right? Tough at the beginning and then you can be a bit nicer. Pilate made that mistake, but he failed. Okay, he came into Judea, and early on, there was the first problem. The Roman cohort of soldiers, the Roman regiment, or the Italian regiment, came into Jerusalem, and during the night they put up their signs, their banners, and the banners are fluttering on the Antonia fortress, which is up above the temple, and it had on it an image of Caesar. Right? And so in the morning, all the priests go in to do their work in the temple. They look up, and there's an image of a false god floating over the temple. They went crazy. And so they all marched out, a whole load of Jews marched out to the coast to see Pilate and to demand that those things get brought down. And Pilate surrounded those people with his soldiers, and he said to them, essentially, I'm going to count to 3 and then you're out of here. Otherwise, I'm going to kill you. And he didn't realize what he was dealing with Jews. 1, 2, and they went, go on then. And they bared their necks, laid down and prepared to die because they'd rather die than accept a false god fluttering over the temple. And so Pilate went, never mind. And he'd lost. That's like a threat on day 1 as a teacher that you don't follow through on. You're never going to have credibility, right? And Pilate had blown it at the start. But that was only the first tension. The second tension was related to the aqueduct. He arranged, probably with the Sanhedrin, access to funding to get a water system, a water supply into Jerusalem. He thought the Jews will love this. And the Jews discovered in their newspaper that the funds had come from the temple treasury, and they went crazy. They did not like that one bit. And so they were upset with him, and the reports were starting to leak back to Rome. A third episode happened when he wanted to honor the emperor, because reports are getting back to the emperor. I want to keep the emperor happy. Well, I'm not going to put his head up over, the temple. That got us in trouble before. Let me have some golden shields made, little shields that can hang on the wall with just his name. No pictures, because the Jews don't like that, so just his name, but he'll love it. When he gets notification and a little picture, a little Polaroid of me next to a shield, he's going to think really nice things, right? And so Pilate sets up these golden shields in Herod's palace in Jerusalem, and one of the cleaners, who's Jewish, notices, takes a picture on their phone, and the word gets out that he's put up an image again. Herod, the guy that was king up in Galilee and Perea, so he's kind of the neighboring guy, he complained to Pilate, to Caesar about Pilate, probably thinking, I might be able to get the ethnarchy here. If I'm on the Caesar's side, I'm going to be doing okay. So there's all this politics, and Pilate's stuck in the middle of it, and he received a letter from the Caesar basically saying, if you mess up, I'm going to kill you. So you honor the Jews. Stop messing around with these Jewish people. And so the Caesar rebukes him for the thing that he was trying to honor the Caesar with. And all of that is background, right? Pilate, Jewish leaders, who if they send just a postcard to Rome could get him finished, and he's got to deal with them, and they're bringing a prisoner to him. Now, the one other element is that actually after the Shields episode, they gathered again in the courtyard, and there they were, and he had his soldiers in the midst of them, in plain clothes with clubs. And on a certain command, the soldiers were supposed to pull out the clubs and hit a few people to create a sense of intimidation, to remind them who's in charge. The soldiers thought this is going to be a great laugh, and they pulled out swords and started killing people. And that had got back to Rome. So you see the tensions that Pilate has. Pilate is really, really trapped. And they bring Jesus to him, and he hates these Jewish leaders because they're the ones that are probably going to get him dealt with ultimately. And he's got to deal with it. Oh, there's one other thing. All this stuff that was going on for Pilate. He'd also heard that his friend, Sejanus, the one that had got him the job in the first place, he'd been assassinated, killed in Rome, thrown down the steps and into the river. He was finished, and they were after anyone associated with him. And Pilate is absolutely petrified. And so when they bring Jesus to Pilate, Pilate says, what charge do you bring against this man? It flusters the Jews because they think they've got him under their thumb. They think they can control him. And he says, what charge? And they say, this is one of my favorite lines in all of legal history, if he were not guilty, we would not have brought him to you. You imagine that in a court of law today. What's the charge against the defendant? Well, he's obviously guilty, or he wouldn't be here, would he? Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, okay, kill him. I mean, it's just a bizarre statement. They're flustered about what is the charge. And Pilate takes their charge and he talks to Jesus, and his conclusion is this man is innocent. There is nothing. And this man is clearly innocent, and he wants to let this man go, but he's trapped. And so as you work through it, John combines the two accounts. Doesn't send him off to Herod. The plan to send him to Herod was just to let Herod be the bad guy. Let Herod do the deed. But Herod sends him back, which was awkward. And so basically, when you're reading through John's account, Pilate is desperate to release Jesus. He says to him, okay, how about I release a prisoner once a year, I release a prisoner, and that whole thing. And you think, well, how's that a strategy? He thinks they're going to say, oh, so you'll condemn him and then release him? That's good enough. If you'll say he's guilty, we'll accept that. But they demand Barabbas instead. Pilate says, okay, what about if I beat him? If I give him a real beating, is that okay for you? And they just keep shouting, crucify, crucify. And a third thing, you see Pilate inside, at the start of chapter 19, he's inside talking to Jesus, and it says he's seeking to find a way to release him. I think he was considering letting him out the back door. I mean, Jesus is inside, they're outside, there's this whole crowd of people there, who are all temple workers, by the way. This wasn't the Jewish crowd that said, welcome Jesus and blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Those people are still in their tents on the other side of town, waking up. This is a group of workers from the temple, 300 of them, that have been roused and told, you get in there and do what you're told. And Pilate thinks this is a representative sample. This is no changeable crowd. This is people that are doing what they're told. And there's this crowd that are angry and these leaders that want Jesus dead. And Pilate is inside talking to Jesus. And I think he's seriously doing this, thinking, is that a cupboard or is that an exit? Because if that's an exit, I could just let him out. I mean, he's doing everything he can. And then the final phrase comes through the window. Do you know what it is? The thing that does the job from the Jewish perspective? You're no friend of Caesar's. And maybe at that moment he looked down at the ring on his finger that had Amicus Caesari on it, the friend of Caesar, and it was a special club. Only special people got into it, and you don't get out, except by death, if you're humiliated. And I think at that moment, whether he was wearing the ring or not, when he heard you are no friend of Caesar's, he knew, if I do anything but kill this man, my career and my life is over. And in that moment, he could have chosen Jesus, but he chose Pilate. And so he took him out and handed him over to them to be crucified. So those are the 6 trials of Jesus. And that makes sense to us. It's fascinating to read that. But why does John miss Herod? Not so significant. Matthew and Mark miss that one as well. Why does he miss the Caiaphas trials? Why does he not deal with the Sanhedrin condemning Jesus to death? He skips from Annas to Pilate. Here's why I think John skips that. Because it doesn't add anything new to what he's already covered in his book. It's not that he didn't know about it, he would have known about it. It's that he's already seen and presented Jesus on trial and condemned by the Jewish leadership for most of the gospel. And here's the part of the legal system that I think we miss. And as long as we miss it, we're going to struggle to understand the Gospels and what's going on. How does the legal system work in the Middle East in those days, in the ancient Near East? Basically, there's no courthouse. There's no official judge. There's no jury duty where people are called in from the general public to help make a decision. It's not separated like it is in Britain or America or Western European countries. It's a system that happens on the street. So at any time, on the street, a trial can begin. All it takes is somebody to accuse somebody else and to call the crowd to be a judge, effectively. And so let's say we implemented this system here at ELF. I think maybe it's worth it. We could try and spread this through all the networks and implement it just to help us understand the Bible. All right, so you're in the dining room and you go off to get a drink of water. When you come back, you notice that your slice of Polish deer has been moved onto the person's plate next to you. Right? And you go, you're stealing my food. Now, you don't take them off to meet the leaders of the ELF in some hidden room somewhere. You just start the trial. I accuse you of stealing my deer. Right? And then everyone who's sitting at that table becomes part of that court scene. Right there, they're like, okay, how's this one going to play out? Prove it. Okay, prove that you didn't steal it. And there's this instant court reality. And it seems strange to us, doesn't it? Because we don't live in that kind of a world. But in the Bible, that was normal. Decisions were made on the streets by not everybody, but certain kinds of people. And if there's a trial, there's a problem, let's get it sorted. And so where's the trial of Jesus begin? In John's Gospel. The trial of Jesus does not begin in John 18, it begins in John 5. Okay, so we've got John chapters 1 to 4, which give us this very definite section with Cana to Cana and the 2 signs and a progression from unbelief to belief among the Jews and progression of unbelief to belief among non-Jews. And so you get that whole introduction. And then in chapter 5, Jesus is in Jerusalem. And he heals a man who's a cripple. And it's a bit of a strange story. What time do we finish this session, by the way? Is it 1:15, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, John 5, there's this man who's been an invalid for 38 years. And Jesus goes to him and says, do you want to be healed? Seems kind of obvious, but he asks him that, and the guy does not say yes. He just explains why he hasn't been. All right, and so Jesus heals him, and that's verse 9. Then we're told that that day was the Sabbath, obviously. Jesus seems to only work on Sabbaths when you read Gospels. That's slightly facetious, but there's a lot of Sabbath action, isn't there? And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. What's that in legal terms? That's an accusation. Hugh, could you grab me a drink, please? Thanks. So, you're carrying your bed on the Sabbath. That's against the law. What does that man do immediately? Thanks. Next verse 11, what was that? He gives a reason. Yeah, it's a defense. It's more than that. It's someone else.
Yeah.
In effect, what he says is, you don't want to press charges against me. I'm just carrying. Okay, you want to go after the dealer. You want to get the man who told me to carry my mat. He's the one you should be after. And it's a real. This man is scared. He knows. He's got Jewish officials with their Jewish robes on, and they're saying, you're breaking the law. No, it's him. Wrong, because every clue in this passage is that this guy does not respond well to Jesus. And if you compare him to the blind man in John 9, the blind man in John 9 gets on trial in front of them, and he puffs out his chest and he says, do you want to be his disciple as well? And what are you saying? And, he just goes after them with a boldness. This guy just seems like, no. And so then he doesn't know who Jesus is, which is strange. Why does he not ask his name? He doesn't know anything. Excuse me. And then Jesus finds him, and Jesus says to him, see, you are well, verse 14, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. What's going on there? Some sin issue. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. So actually, I appreciate what you're saying, Tom, but I think in this passage, this guy does not respond to Jesus. At any point, we always want to make every person in the Bible nice, but this guy, I don't think, if you can chat to him in heaven, I think I've misunderstood it. I don't think this guy's a believer at all. Okay, so he's in trouble, and instead of taking that, he passes the buck on to Jesus. He doesn't know who Jesus is, but the moment he finds out who Jesus is, he immediately goes back and says, here, I can give you his name, here's a picture, he's the one you want. Am I free? Good, thank you very much. And he walks away. And so they come to Jesus with their accusation. And the accusation is, verse 16, they're persecuting him, he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them. Effectively, what Jesus says here is, please, if we're going to have a court trial, don't go after me about the Sabbath. That is such a minor issue. If you're going to try me for this. Have you got your pens and papers ready? My Father is working until now, and I am working. There you go. Now, what's that going to do in a trial? Imagine if he's being charged with breaking the Sabbath, and he says, my Father is working until now, as in God is working on the Sabbath. That's quite a statement. And I am working. I'm the same as him. I'm with him. His equality, it's gone from a trial about Sabbath breaking to a trial of blasphemy. And it was Jesus' choice. Now, how long does this trial go on for? Yeah, well, this is certainly a while. So chapter 5, we'll come back and look at that. Chapter 6 talks about the Passover, which means that chapter 5 was a feast of the Jews. I think it was that Passover, but the way it's written, it could have been one preceding that or an earlier occasion. So we've got, at the very latest, spring. And let's say, if we say that Jesus was crucified in 33, which is one of the options that I tend to go that way, then this is at the latest spring of 32. Okay? Then he's up in Galilee, chapter 6, feeds the multitude and so on. And then chapter 7, he comes back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. That's in autumn, so September, October, right, of 32. And Jesus is coming back there. So this is 6 months after John 5. And what's the issue in John 7? Let's see if we can spot the verse here. So verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. What work? It's the healing of the man back in chapter 5. And so the conversation goes on, and they're still chasing him here, and it carries straight on through to chapter 8, and eventually at the end of chapter 8, they pick up stones to stone him. But it's all in reference to what happened at that spring day when Jesus raised the man by the pool. So John 5 starts something that carries on from spring right the way into the fall. Then you keep going. John 9, John 10, we're told in the second half of John 10 that there's the Feast of Dedication. That's around end of the year for us. Christmas in our terms. And so that's the winter festival. Jesus is there. And there's more reference there to the same issue going on. Death of Lazarus, maybe February of 33. And then, because he raises Lazarus, then they really decide we're going to kill him, we're going to kill Lazarus, we're going to do whatever we can. And you get through to chapter 12, and that's the Passover of Jesus' death. So the trial of Jesus, I would say, begins at least 1 year before he gets introduced to Annas in the middle of the night. Okay, so it's this 1 year, maybe longer, ongoing trial. And that makes sense of an awful lot of things in the Gospels. We get that in Matthew, Mark, Luke as well. Times where they wanted to seize him, but they could not. Why couldn't they? Or they wanted to kill him, but they couldn't. And I tend to think, actually, if you want to kill somebody, you kind of can. I know they couldn't because God was stopping them, but it's not that hard to kill somebody. Why couldn't they? Legally, they hadn't proved their case. And that creates a real tension. So times where the crowd is really angry with Jesus, Jesus answers them and is able to walk away from them. Some of that is supernatural. Some of that is legal. He's not quite what they want him to be. He can't quite prove that he's guilty. Popular with the people, but there's this popular with the people up north. And you've got to get that tension that when, in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, when you see people from Jerusalem, that's when the tension begins. In John, he's almost always in Jerusalem, and so there's almost always tension. And so the real tension is down in Jerusalem.
When they tried to stone him,
yeah.
was that because they were so angry that they forgot the legal way?
I think they felt in that moment when he said, before Abraham was, I am, that proves it. Based on what he said, we all agree that he is absolutely guilty of blasphemy because they can't imagine that it could be true. And so they determine that is definitely guilty. And so who carries out the sentence? They do. That's the way the system works in those days.
But still they had to go to the Romans.
I think they had to go to the Romans during a festival. When there's a festival going on, the Pilate's in town, there's extra Roman soldiers. Part of the kind of arrangement is, okay, Sanhedrin, you deal with local religious law. We'll deal with taxation. We'll use tax collectors to help us. We will not give you the right to do capital punishment. You can't kill people. Obviously, sometimes you'll get carried away, whatever. But during the festivals, you don't kill anybody. So I think that's what happens with Stephen. Is they're so angry with Stephen, they take him out and they stone him. All right, and that's their normal reaction. But when the festivals are happening, the Passover, the Pentecost, and then the festival of Tabernacles, booths at the end of the year, I think there's, generally speaking, within that time at least an agreement. You don't do any killing. You arrange that with me. Now this is tail end of Tabernacles, and so I think it's mostly their anger. They think, forget this, we've got to deal with it, but they're not able to. So it's an interesting tension between Jewish authority and Roman authority. And there is some debate, do the Jews have any right to execute? And those who say they don't will say, well, sometimes they'll get carried away. Of that. But legally speaking, I would say that the accusation actually comes in 5. They're deliberating, how can we co-opt, how can we handle him in 3? But in 5, we've got to get him. He's a lawbreaker. For them, that's a big issue. And the tensions of that, and understanding it in the context of a legal back and forth, I think makes sense of the text. So if you look at 5, he makes that statement, making himself equal with God, and then he starts speaking. Remember we said that there's lots of red ink. I don't have a red ink Bible, but you know what I mean by that. Lots of Jesus speaking. He doesn't take a breath for the rest of the chapter. I think because Jesus knows, I've just made a statement here that is absolutely huge. And I've got to now defend myself in such a way that I can walk away from this. I don't want to diminish Jesus into some sort of purely human thinker, but I think in the context culturally, there's definitely a sense of that. So he begins verses 19 to 29 by talking almost theoretically. He talks about the Father and the Son and 2 issues, the giving of life and judgment. And the Father has given the right to the Son to give life, and the Father has given all judgment into the hands of the Son. And he's talking kind of out here, and they're probably listening to that going, not quite tracking, but that's impressive. And then from verse 30, he stops saying, Father, Son, Father, Son, Father, Son. He starts saying, I and you. There's a real face-to-face confrontation that happens from that point on. And if you count up the references, the numbers there, it's stunning. The shift from Father, Son, kind of hypothetically somebody over here, to I, you, between the 19 to 29 and 30 to 49, or the end of the section. It's a massive shift, so that it's something like 6 to 1 ratio of Father, Son kind of references to 1 reference of I. And the I reference is just the truly, truly I say to you. Once you come after verse 30 to the end, it's not just that it switches sort of 6 to 1, now it's 1 to 6. It goes to something like 32 to 1 or something like that. It really becomes very confrontational. And there's a shift going on, because what he does here is he calls witnesses. Okay, so when Tom said something like 7 arguments, that kind of simplifies it together in this section. He's giving this presentation in 19 to 29 about the Father and the Son, life and judgment. And then from verse 30 on, he starts calling witnesses. And what are his witnesses? Well, first of all, notice the legal language. Verse 30. I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Even the language of being sent is legal, courtroom language. I'm a representative of. I come with his authority. When I speak, it's his words. It's like an ambassador in legal terms. And he says, if I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not deemed true. Right? If I just give, well, here's my testimony, no one's going to believe that. People want 2 witnesses. And he says, I've got another witness. There is another who bears witness about me, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. Who's that witness? Verse 32. I have another witness, and I know that the testimony that he bears about me is true. Who is that other witness? First, Father? Okay, look at the text. Okay, there's a whole load of them. It looks like it's going to be John the Baptist. I don't think it is. I think what he says here is, you sent to John, and if you want John, fine. He's on my side too, but I'm talking about a different level of witness here. Before you get to that, verse 36, but the testimony that I have is greater than that of John. Here's my other witness. The works that the Father has given me. So there's the miracles. The works that I'm doing bear witness about me, that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. That's his ultimate. You want a second witness? Me and my Father. He brings his Father into it. And this is interesting. You kind of start to wonder, is Jesus defending himself, or is he starting to turn this thing around? Because this is the way that the legal system worked in those days, is that what's to stop you from going around and accusing people of things? Well, if they're not guilty, they can turn it back on you, and you can be in trouble for a false accusation. And here Jesus turns the whole thing around. He says, okay, my other witness is the Father, my Father. And then he starts poking them. His voice you have never heard. His form you have never seen. And you do not have his word abiding in you. Wow. Imagine saying that to the Jewish leaders. He carries on. For you do not believe the one whom he has sent, which is me. And then he says something that I think is, in some ways, maybe one of the ultimate challenges for us as preachers and teachers and church leaders and people that other people look to. Notice what he says, verse 39. You search the scriptures, you're diligent, because you think that in them you have eternal life. And it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. It's possible to be a diligent Bible person and to miss the person who's in the Bible. It's possible to be a very religious Christian, small c, very religiously studying the Bible, looking for all the instructions so that I can be a better me, and you can miss the person who's there, the person who's trying to reveal himself through scriptures. And it's not just a missing of, he says you refuse. This is where I talk about that tension in churches where you introduce Jesus and Christians get upset. Christian gets to be quite a loose word eventually, doesn't it? People get upset by Jesus. There's a problem here. He says, I do not receive glory from people. Now, we're really short on time, so let's make this really simple. There's horizontal and there's vertical. Okay? He says, I, Jesus, don't receive glory from people. I'm not chasing, lots of people to be impressed by me. But I know that you do not have the love of God vertical within you. How do those two relate? Glory, love, vertical, horizontal. 43, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, horizontal, you will receive him. Because you're living on the horizontal, you're not connected on the vertical. And so, whether it's a glory theme, a glory issue, or a love issue, you're living on this level. What do people think of me? What do people think of me? What do people think of me? And because you're living there, you have nothing of the, what does God think of me? Who is God? Does the love of God fill my heart? And Jesus is saying, horizontal, vertical, they are not blendable. They don't go together. And I find this incredibly challenging, because I know in my flesh, I can go back to the horizontal so easily, can't you? What do people think of me? How are people evaluating me? How can I describe what I do so people are impressed? And Jesus pokes that here and says that was exactly the problem with the Jewish leaders. And then he culminates that at verse, where are we up to here? 44. How can you believe in the one that comes from the Father when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? Something we've got to wrestle with is how glory and love work together, and what kind of glory are we pursuing in our lives and ministries. And then look what he says, 45, do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. Why is he talking about accusing? Because legally that's what he's done here. He's turned it around from being accused to being the accuser. But he says, actually, it's not me. There is one who accuses you, that's Moses, on whom you've set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me, but you do not believe his writings, then how will you believe my words? And I think that speech is so stunning that Jesus is able to travel back up to Galilee. If he had just said, my Father is working till now and so am I, and then gone quiet, I don't think he would be walking away easily. He might walk away supernaturally, but he wouldn't walk away easily, because they would have gone after him. But he said, okay, I've got them, they're like this, right, and he talks. And his talk to them is so powerful and it's so persuasive that they know at this point, okay, we haven't got him. But as they retreat, we're going to get him. And that's the tension that goes all the way through John. You've got Jesus revealing the Father so that those who do receive him can become children of God. And at the same time, you've got those who do not receive him so angered that they're trying to kill him all the way through.